a 1912, Alabama, the forgotten parish where they found 41 coffins, but no graves. They said the coffins had no names, no plates, no markings, just thick pine boxes stacked behind the rotted walls of the old vestry, lined like cordwood along the stone foundation, hidden behind shelves of mildewed hymnals and moth-eaten choir robes. When the demolition crew broke through the far wall of St. Leander's Parish in the spring of 1912, they didn't expect to find one coffin, let alone 41, let alone unopened, unburied, preserved not in soil but in dry, cloying air. The men stopped working. The foreman vomited in the corner, and no one, not the sheriff, not the bishop, not even the two archivists brought from Montgomery, could explain why there were bodies in a church that had not held a funeral in over 60 years. The town of Ashbridge was not on any map by 1912. It was 47 miles southeast of Selma, though no proper road reached it anymore, and none had for decades. The town's founding charter, such as it was, bore the year 1834, but little else survived. One man had once compiled a family tree of Ashbridge's early settlers in the county office, but the document was misfiled, then lost. The town's name still appeared in handwritten form on deeds and wills, always spelled slightly differently: Ashbridge, Ashbray, Asbridge. Most people thought it had been swallowed up by the boll weevil migration or lost to the yellow fever. But Ashbridge had never burned, never drowned, never vanished all at once. It simply faded. People left one by one. By 1909, only the parish remained. St. Leander's stood at the edge of what had once been the town square, hemmed in by a bramble-choked cemetery, the stone markers half fallen or blank. The demolition was ordered after decades of requests. A preservationist had written to the diocese about salvaging the bell tower's cast iron. The letter went unanswered. Then, inexplicably in 1911, the bishop granted a teardown with no explanation. He sent two men, Brother Edward Thorne and Father Mallory Clay. The latter had been born in the region, near Tallapoosa, though he'd spent most of his priesthood in Boston. What brought him back was unclear. But locals remembered his face when he stepped from the train in Selma, drawn, gaunt, pale as death. Some thought he was sick. Others whispered he was being punished. He didn't speak much, and when he did, his voice barely rose above a whisper. He said he was there to bury the past. St. Leander's was built in 1841, in the late Federal style, though stripped of ornament. It sat low to the ground, cruciform, with narrow windows and thick shutters. The foundation was brick, though one corner had begun to sink into the loam. Behind the altar was a vestry and, beyond that, a door that had been nailed shut from the inside. No one remembered it ever being opened. It was that door they pried loose on April 2, 1912. Behind it a wall of dust and rot, wood and fabric, and behind that the coffins, stacked in silence like an ossuary, 41, each one nailed shut, though not all perfectly. Some lids gapped slightly, revealing tufts of fabric. One was warped and split open at the foot. The stench was bearable, musty but not putrid, not fresh, not ancient, as if the air itself had preserved them. The sheriff came. Then the bishop from Montgomery. The site was cordoned. Photographs were taken, notes scribbled, boxes labeled. The dead were removed one at a time and stored in the chapel under white sheets. But no names were ever found, no ledgers, no parish death records, no obituaries in the Selma Gazette. Even the graveyard outside held no clues, only 17 headstones, most eroded past legibility. No one could explain who the 41 had been, or when, exactly, they had died. The only clue came from a letter, found in a rusted tin box under the pulpit, sealed with wax and signed Father Lionel Cobb, dated 1866. It was brief. The ones who cannot rest are not to be disturbed. This was their pact. I only witnessed it. They chose silence over salvation. God forgive me. But Cobb's name did not appear in any diocesan record. He was not on the parish rolls. His handwriting was florid, the ink black with age, and his signature matched nothing in the archives. Some believed the letter was a hoax. Others were not so sure. The town's last living residents, aged and scattered across the region, had little to offer. One woman in Troy remembered her grandmother speaking of a place where the bells stopped ringing in 1863. Another, in Mobile, recalled an uncle who left Ashbridge and never spoke of it again. except to say, in a drunken stupor, that the ground there turned sour after the war. And there was the census. In 1860, Ashbridge held 2 to 14 residents. By 1870, it listed 12. The coffins were never claimed. The coroner declared them too old to autopsy. Their cause of death was listed as an undetermined. They were reburied in a mass grave outside Selma, with a single stone that read Parish dead, 1912. But some say they never stayed in the ground, and others say they never died in the first place. It begins, as such stories often do, with a church that should not have existed. The land where St. Leander's stood was never consecrated. The original deed was unsigned. The church's founding priest, Father Desmond Rourke, was never ordained through the Southern Vicariate. He came from Louisiana in 1838, with a mule-drawn cart and a small iron crucifix he claimed had belonged to a martyr. He said the land called to him, that it was hallowed in absence. By 1841, the church was raised with the labor of townsfolk, white farmers and enslaved hands alike. The wood was cedar, hauled from a defunct mill 3 counties over. The altar stone was granite, chipped and uneven, taken from the ruins of an abandoned Spanish fort. Even the stained glass was repurposed. Panes scavenged from a sacked Episcopalian chapel in Mississippi. Nothing about St. Leander's was original. Everything had lived another life. Father Rourke held services at odd hours, sunrise on Tuesdays, midnight on feast days. His sermons were never written down. Witnesses said he spoke of fire that cleanses and silence that forgives, that his voice was low and slow, that his eyes never met the congregation. In 1846, he vanished. The church was closed for 3 years. When it reopened, no one asked who led the prayers. The cemetery, such as it was, began around 1850. No formal register existed. Graves appeared without notice. Headstones were hand-carved. Many bore only initials. Several had none. And then came the war. Ashbridge was never a battleground, but it was a place people fled to. Records show dozens of refugees from burned-out farms and collapsed plantations passed through the area between 1862 and 1865. Some stayed, some didn't, but the population rose, and then suddenly it fell. The 1860 State Survey lists Ashbridge as functionally uninhabited. No fire, no flood, no epidemic. The reason given was general dissolution. A letter sent from a Union inspector, who passed through the region in late 1865, described the town as somnolent, inward, facing, and hostile to approach. Church doors locked. Graves fresh but unattended. Children seen but not heard. He spent one night in the rectory of St. Leander's. He reported dreams of distant weeping, of bodies beneath floorboards, of women whispering behind walls. He left before dawn. The letter was filed, then forgotten, until 1912. And now, even that has disappeared. By the time the Montgomery men returned in May, the church had already begun to collapse inward. The air inside was different, denser, hotter, despite the early spring cool. Moss grew in corners it hadn't before. The pews had gone soft with rot, and there were flies, not many but persistent, slow, circling the emptied vestry like they were waiting for something to return. Father Mallory Clay, who had stayed behind to oversee spiritual closure, had stopped writing reports. The bishop's office received only a single note, handwritten on the back of a funeral card, which read, "They are not silent anymore." When the investigators finally forced their way back into the chapel, they found Clay slumped at the base of the altar. Alive, but incoherent. He was whispering over and over. There were 42. His fingernails had been torn away. There were no signs of forced entry, no intruders, no tracks in the dust. But someone had relit the altar candles. The investigation was quietly closed that summer. The report was sealed, then redacted, then simply vanished. Some say it was absorbed into a broader inquiry from the Attorney General's office regarding ecclesiastical misappropriation. Others believe it never reached Montgomery at all, but the letter, Clay's final note, circulated among archivists for years. Passed from hand to hand, it became a curiosity, an artifact of madness, until one reader caught the phrasing. There were 42, not 41. One coffin missing. Which begs the question, if one was missing from the vestry, where did it go? There are stories. A farmhand near Minter claimed he saw a man dragging a long wooden box through the cane fields in 1913. Said the box hummed. He fled and never went back. In 1921, a surveyor found a shallow depression in the woods 20 miles from Ashbridge. Something long had been buried there and recently moved. The soil beneath was dry as bone, but none of it could be proved. And then there was the photograph. Unearthed in a trunk in 1946 by a historian cataloging the private holdings of a retired Jesuit librarian. The photo shows the interior of St. Leander's vestry in 1912, before removal. It's a grainy, formal shot meant to document the coffins for record keeping. But on the far left, nearly obscured by shadow, stands a narrow figure, too tall, thin as rails, eyes closed, hands clasped, wearing a collar. Some say it was clay. Others say it was no one who ever lived. They tried to retake the photo the next day, but the vestry collapsed before the photographer could return. No second shot was ever taken. St. Leander's was leveled that autumn, and nothing has grown on that plot since. Just red dirt. Cracked, sterile, silent. The locals now call it the Hollow. Children dare each other to stand there in the heat of summer, barefoot. They say the ground hums faintly, like it's remembering. But the deeper question was never answered. Not where the coffins came from, but why they were kept and why they were hidden, not buried. There is one more letter. Found not in Ashbridge, but in a sealed collection of diocesan correspondence sent from New Orleans in 1859, never opened until 1978. It was unsigned, but its script matched that of Father Lionel Cobb's supposed note. It reads, "The bodies are only vessels. The pact is older than the church. They came not for sanctuary but containment." This is not redemption. This is stillness. And stillness is not peace. The historian who discovered the letter burned it, but not before transcribing it by hand. His notes end with the words, "St. Leander's was not a church. It was a lid. And sometimes lids come loose." The final census of Ashbridge lists one surviving family in 1910, the Delrys, a widow and her daughter. They lived in a house beside the churchyard, near the edge of the pines. In 1912, they vanished. Their home was found empty. Plates still set for dinner, water boiling dry on the stove. The only sign of departure was a single line etched into the plaster above the door. 42. Beneath it, written in smaller hand, childlike. He said they didn't want graves. The bishop's office issued no comment. The story was quietly buried, but not everyone forgot. In 1972, a local historian visiting Selma found a faded map at a county records office, showing the original boundary lines of Ashbridge. There, marked in faint ink beside the parish grounds, was a narrow plot labeled Rest House. No records of its purpose, no ownership documents, just that name, the Rest House. He followed the coordinates. The land was gone, or rather sunk. A gully had opened some years prior. Locals said it was a sinkhole. But no geological anomaly was found. Just a hollow, unnaturally circular 30 feet deep. The historian threw a rock in. He never heard it hit the bottom. He left that night. He never spoke of Ashbridge again. And in 1983, his personal journals were discovered in an attic trunk by his son. On the last page, a single line. They are still waiting for the 42nd. The silence that fell after the collapse of St. Leander's wasn't the peace of closure. It was heavier than that, like a breath being held. The land itself remained inert, untouched by regrowth, as if something beneath the earth refused to release its hold on the surface. Birds didn't nest in the nearby trees. Locals avoided the path altogether, even though by 1915 the road had eroded into barely a suggestion between the kudzu. But some remembered. An archivist from Tuscaloosa, curious about the missing records of Ashbridge, visited the Selma County Library in 1927 to retrieve census ledgers, land surveys, and parish logs. What she found instead were irregularities. Books with blank pages where names should have been, microfilms degraded only at the frames where Ashbridge was mentioned, clerical margins trimmed clean with razored precision. She did find a small collection of hand-written notes bound in twine, left behind by an assistant coroner named Miles Dunn. His original autopsy notes from 1912 were never officially submitted. These pages were different from the formal report. They were personal, uneasy. He described the bodies in the coffins as too clean, not embalmed, not decomposed, but dried, desiccated like husks. Some wore garments stitched not with cotton thread, but with horsehair, and not in any recognizable pattern. Spirals, loops, runes. He tried to photograph one, but the negative blackened. In one case, a woman's mouth had been sewn shut with brass wire. But when he snipped it open, he found nothing inside. No tongue, no teeth. Only a tiny scroll of cloth, rolled and tied, shoved down her throat. It contained a phrase in Latin. Dormientibus vigilamus. We watch while they sleep. Dunn left Selma 3 days later and never returned. His personal effects were donated posthumously to the university library, where they were misplaced until 1969. The cloth scroll, however, was never found. In 1934, a group of surveyors working for a New Deal infrastructure project stumbled across the Ashbridge site again. They were assessing old lots for electrification. One report mentions a former settlement with unusual ground resistance. Cables failed to hold tension. Poles wouldn't stand. Holes dug for anchoring filled instantly with thick, wet clay, even when there had been no rain. They packed up and moved the line 5 miles north. The project supervisor, in an offhand comment scribbled in a personal journal, noted, "That place won't take a wire. It's like the earth pushes back." One of the men, a Cherokee laborer named Levy Watts, refused to go near the Parish site, said it smelled like shut-up rooms and burnt sugar. He told a story passed down from his grandfather about a place not far from there. The place where the wind won't carry smoke. A kind of bad ground. A place people forgot not because it was lost, but because it was made to be forgotten. That year, 5 boys from a nearby orphanage wandered into the hollow on a dare. Only one came back. He wouldn't speak for 6 months. When he did, he only repeated the phrase, "She opened the last one." No one knew what he meant. The orphanage burned down the following spring. By the time the centennial of the church's founding arrived in 1941, there were no commemorations. No one in Selma mentioned it. The bishopric was silent. The land remained unsold. And that year, a local journalist researching Alabama's lost churches wrote a single column about Ashbridge. It never ran. The typesetter refused to lay the lines. He claimed the letters shifted on the tray, that words disappeared between inkings. The column was pulled, but the journalist kept his drafts. One paragraph read, "If St. Leander's was built as a house of God, then its tenants had long since moved out. Whatever remained behind those walls, whatever was boxed and nailed and hidden, wasn't resting. It was being kept." As if those who built it knew that some things, once spoken, echo forever. In the bottom margin he had scrawled a final line, "You don't stack coffins like that unless you're afraid of digging." By the 1950s, the land was referred to only in whisper. State maps left a blank patch where the parish had stood, like an inkblot error. No topographic elevation, no road in or out, only a void. Still, people came. Not many, not often, but enough. A folklorist from the University of Chicago, a defrocked priest from Atlanta, a woman claiming to be a distant descendant of Father Rourke. Each arrived quietly. None left a full account. But the folklorist mailed a postcard to a colleague before she vanished. It bore no message, just a photograph of cracked red soil and the faint impression of a boot print beside it. The name on the postcard was misspelled. Ashbury. As if even paper refused to remember correctly. And then came the child. In 1957, a 7-year-old boy was found wandering the roadside south of Orville, naked, mud-streaked, shivering. When picked up by a passerby, he refused to speak. He carried nothing but a dried flower in his palm. Indian pipe, a ghost plant, native to deep shade. At the hospital, when asked his name, he finally answered, "Lander." The doctors assumed trauma, abuse, abandonment. But there were no missing children named Leander. No reports. No fingerprints on file. When asked where he came from, he whispered, "From where the dirt doesn't sleep." He was placed in foster care. Within 6 months, he was gone. No record of transfer. No forwarding file. The only trace he left behind was a single drawing in crayon, tucked into a school book. It showed a long black box, and beneath it, something crawling out from the dirt. It had no face. The drawing was never catalogued, never studied. It sat for decades inside a forgotten file in the Wilcox County School District archives, stored in a battered manila folder labeled simply L. Most wouldn't notice the quiet terror in the crude lines. A child's drawing, after all, always leaves room for interpretation. But to those who knew the stories, to those who had heard whispers of Ashbridge and St. Leander's, the image was unmistakable. It was a coffin, but not sealed. The lid was halfway open, drawn with such force that the crayon had torn through the paper, and beneath it, something impossibly long, not a body, not a man, but a suggestion of shape. A neck too thin, arms too many, a face not drawn at all, just a blank space, the absence of a face. Below the drawing, written in trembling cursive, was a single word: remember. For those who had spent their lives in research, historians, theologists, archivists, it became an unspoken obsession. The story of Ashbridge, if it could be called a story at all, had no beginning and no end. It was a puzzle with half its pieces rotted away, a whisper in an archive, a rumor that survived only because it was too strange to fully die. In 1962, a Jesuit scholar named Father Eamon Tully began compiling what he called the Coffin Dossier. He was based in Mobile, and his interest was purely academic at first: parish records, burial practices, obscure liturgical architecture. But once he found a single offhand line in the Diocese of New Orleans archives, a ledger listing the 1879 transference of anomalous remains from Acadiana to designated containment site, C. Ashbridge, he knew the shape of the thing beneath the veil. His first entry in the dossier read, "The church was not a house for worship. It was a sarcophagus." Tully traced back every available lead: shipment manifests from 1878, cemetery permits that were signed but never used, 3 freight invoices for long wooden crates sent from St. Martinville. The names of the recipients had been scrubbed, but one was preserved by accident, handwritten in the margin by a distracted clerk of Far El Cobb. Tully began to see a pattern. The crates, coffins really, had never been filled in Ashbridge. They had arrived already occupied. The church had not housed the dead of its town, but the remnants of something much older, much stranger. Louisiana dead, ferried across the state line not for burial, but containment. The question was never who died in Ashbridge. The question was why they were brought there to begin with. In his final dossier entry before vanishing, Tully speculated on a connection to a near-forgotten French Catholic order, Les Veilleurs de l'Aube, the Watchers of the Dawn. Founded in 1712, excommunicated in 1825, they were known not for their theology but for their burial rites. Always at night, always in silence, always with the body facing down. Their final recorded act as an order was the secret transport of bodies from a collapsed abbey in Terrebonne Parish. Bodies that, according to the only surviving parish record, had spoken beneath the shroud. That record was signed by one Father Lionel Cobb. The trail always led back to him, but Cobb had no grave, no obituary, no death certificate, only a line in the diocesan annals dated 1923 for Cobb removed from assignment due to persistent illness of spirit. No further entries. Tully's own disappearance in 1965 was never investigated formally. His notes, several hundred pages, were collected by a theology student in Mobile who, 2 years later, burned them in his dormitory room. Witnesses say he was crying, repeating a phrase over and over: "It was never meant to be opened." The only part that survived the fire was a single water damage diagram, a floor plan of St. Leander's, annotated in Latin, with small handwritten notes in the margins. Near the vestry, where the 41 coffins had been found, Tully had drawn a square room that didn't appear on any official blueprint. He labeled it penultima, the penultimate, one before the last, and under it in red ink, circled 3 times, UX in Coffin 42, the one that was never found, the one that was never supposed to be opened. In 1970, a preacher from Clark County made a strange claim during a backwoods revival service. Mid-sermon, he stopped speaking, stared into the middle distance and shouted, "It ain't buried! It ain't buried! The dirt wouldn't take it!" He collapsed moments later and died of a brain aneurysm. His last words, spoken into the crook of his wife's neck, were, "I heard her breathing." No one knew who he meant. But weeks later, a sinkhole opened near the old Ashbridge site, perfectly circular. No seismic activity, no rainfall. Just a hole in the earth, clean as if drilled. At the bottom a shape, too large to be a box, too narrow to be a room. No one climbed down. and by the next morning the hole had closed. Locals said the ground swallowed itself. But there were footprints, half a dozen, all barefoot, all walking out, and not a single one walking in. The footprints were never officially documented. No local authority filed a report. No photographs were taken. Only the word of a farmer who had been driving past the site early that morning and saw them, a faint chain of ovals pressed into the soft Alabama clay like indentations in wet flour. He didn't follow them. He simply stopped his truck, looked once toward the hollow where the old parish had stood, and then drove back home. That same afternoon, he boarded up his windows and moved north without selling his land. His daughter, who stayed behind, found a note folded inside the family Bible weeks later. It was not addressed to her, but to whoever chooses to stay. It read, in part, "We thought burying it would make it sleep. But the ground remembers everything, and she was never meant to be in the dirt. You can't bury a witness." No one knew who she was, but she kept appearing. In the late 1970s, urban legends began to circulate among the few who remembered Ashbridge. Stories of a pale woman seen walking near Highway 80 just before dawn, always barefoot, always dressed in white, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by the quiet sound of dragging wood. A girl from Demopolis swore she saw the woman, watching her through a cornfield at night. An old man from Fonsdale refused to go outside after sunset because she comes closest when the birds go quiet. There was a pattern to the sightings. Each was followed, days later, by a small tragedy, a house fire, a disappearance, a miscarriage, a school bus that veered off the road in clear daylight. The driver later found clutching the steering wheel so tightly his fingers broke. His last words were, "There were too many in the road. I couldn't drive through all of them." But no bodies were found. No pedestrians. Nothing but an open stretch of pavement surrounded on both sides by scrub oak and silence. By 1982, Ashbridge had been erased from nearly every map. Not just ignored, deliberately removed. A cartographer for the State Geological Survey later admitted that certain parcels of land were quietly omitted at the request of unnamed officials. When pressed, he simply said, "There are places we've agreed not to look at anymore." A newspaper in Selma tried to run a retrospective that year, Forgotten Parishes of the Black Belt. Ashbridge was one of 5 entries. The article never printed. The editor claimed a technical error had corrupted the type. But the typesetter told a different story. He said every time he laid out the section on Ashbridge, the words kept changing. Not misspellings, not typos, changes. The names didn't stay the same, he said. The dates moved. Sometimes there were words that weren't in English at all. And once, the whole column printed in reverse. The presses jammed when they tried again. Eventually, they scrapped the piece entirely. But a proof copy survived, buried in a back room. A journalism student discovered it in 1993, yellowed and brittle. He scanned it into the university archive, but only the header was legible. The parish that wasn't buried. The body of the article was nothing but symbols, a string of X, interspersed with what appeared to be old liturgical glyphs. When the student tried to rescan it, the file corrupted. The hard drive failed. And that night, the window to the archive room blew open despite being locked, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in the space of an hour. There were no footprints, but a trail of dried earth was found across the linoleum floor, leading nowhere. That year, an anthropology professor named Irene Bardsley became obsessed with locating what she called the 42nd. She had no connection to Father Tully. She had never heard of the dossier. But during a routine research trip to the Selma courthouse basement, she found a filing cabinet mislabeled St. Leonard. Inside, only one item, a sketch, coffin layout, 41 marked neatly, and beneath them in darker ink a single word, subtextus. Bardsley translated it as, that which lies beneath the text. That fall, she went missing. She left no will, no goodbye note, only a voicemail on a colleague's machine, timestamped 2:14 a.m., with a single whispered line, the last coffin was hers. Then silence. The call had come from a disconnected number. By 2000, no trace of Ashbridge remained above ground. The trees had reclaimed everything, but satellite images revealed something strange. Vegetation patterns around the former site showed an unnatural symmetry. Oaks grew in rows, identical spacing. Pines along the perimeter formed a nearly perfect oval. No other growth occurred within the central area. No birds nested there. No mammals crossed. It was sterile. And at night, according to infrared scans, it radiated a faint heat signature, despite no geothermal activity for miles. A doctoral student studying soil fertility visited in July 2003. Her team set up a base camp 200 yards from the site. 3 days later, their tent was found shredded, their equipment melted. No bodies were recovered. Only a single audio recording survived, badly damaged, overlaid with static. In the final seconds, beneath the hiss, a faint voice is audible. You cannot enter what never died. A week later, the student's thesis advisor received an unmarked envelope. Inside, a single Polaroid of the Ashbridge clearing. In the center of the frame, something that looked like a tall figure wrapped in linen. But no face. Just a blank white space. Where the eyes should have been, 2 small holes, as if something had looked out once and might still be looking. In the spring of 2007, a structural archaeologist named Miles Keswick received a grant to study defunct parish grounds in the Deep South. His focus was architectural decay in relation to burial practices. He wasn't looking for Ashbridge. In fact, he didn't believe it had existed. He considered the stories bush myth, a regional ghost tale that combined scraps of real history with Southern Gothic nonsense. But then he came across a purchase ledger from 1891, buried in a warehouse catalog in Montgomery. The entry was brief. Ordered 1 foundation crossbeam, Ashbridge site. Length 32 feet oak. Carved. What struck Keswick wasn't the beam's dimensions, but the location. The listed delivery coordinates weren't for a church. They were for a slope of land just beyond a dried-out riverbed, where no building had ever been recorded. And yet beneath that slope, under layers of loam and sand, Keswick's ground-penetrating radar found edges, straight ones, right angles, an unnatural geometry. He excavated only a single corner before stopping. The beam was there intact, blackened but solid. But it wasn't just wood. Someone had etched lines into it, hundreds, maybe thousands, intersecting channels, almost like blood grooves on a blade, but deeper, more deliberate. The lines weren't decorative. They served a purpose. And when he traced them with a soft, bristled brush, his fingers burned. That night, Keswick wrote in his journal, "I've unearthed something that was not meant to be remembered. Not architecture, not a tomb, a lock." He sealed the site, walked away. A month later, he was found wandering the edge of the riverbed naked, muttering phrases in Latin no one could source. He was institutionalized in Birmingham. His notebooks, most of them, were lost, except for 1 scrap of paper recovered from his satchel. It contained 4 words: non sufficit humus. The soil is not enough. After that, Ashbridge slipped from public memory again. The brief interest in it faded under the weight of newer stories, more immediate horrors. But beneath the surface, in obscure theology journals and private anthropology circles, whispers persisted. About the 42nd, about the nameless rites, about the witness who was never buried. And then came the discovery in 2012. A backhoe crew clearing forest for a pipeline project near Wilcox County unearthed something hard. It wasn't a stone. It was wood, petrified and ancient, with a copper bolt driven into its top. The work stopped immediately. Local historians were brought in. The county believed it might be a slave-era grave marker. But what they found was not a headstone. It was a lid, buried just 20 inches below the surface. Not a coffin. A hatch. And sealed beneath it clay tablets, 41 of them, each wrapped in linen, each etched with Latin verses, smeared and warped by moisture. Some bore words that didn't translate, syllables that defied known structure. Linguists called them glossolalia. Others called them warnings. Only 1 tablet was intact. It bore the phrase, "She saw the first death. She will see the last." That night, the worksite burned. No arsonist was ever found. The tablets disappeared, formally lost in transit, between Wilcox County and a university in Georgia. But 2 months later, a set of photographs appeared on a restricted access theology forum. No names, no metadata. Just 23 high-resolution images of the tablets under infrared light. In one of them, Buried in the lower right corner, a mark could be seen, barely distinguishable from the weathered clay. Not a letter, not a symbol, an eye, drawn without iris or pupil, perfectly round, surrounded by scratches, as if someone had tried to scrape it away and failed. The forum shut down a week later. The admin posted only once before vanishing. I saw her in the negative space. By 2015, what few researchers still investigated Ashbridge had stopped referring to it as a town. Not even as a parish. They began calling it by a different name. The 42nd, a code word, a euphemism, a way to refer to the idea without speaking it aloud. Because the more they studied it, the more they realized it wasn't about a place. It was about a presence, a thread that wove itself through time, through burial and silence, and always surfaced again. In early 2016, the Alabama Historical Preservation Office received a package with no return address. Inside a hand-carved box lined with old newspaper clippings. All were connected to Ashbridge, each marked with red pencil. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in wax canvas, was a doll, made of burlap. Its eyes were two small, white stones, no mouth, no limbs, just a long, stretched torso. And stitched into its back, with what appeared to be human hair, were 3 words, I say WCR. To this day, no map of Alabama includes Ashbridge. No road leads directly to the coordinates. No one lives nearby. Game trails bend around the clearing. The trees fall in strange patterns. And late at night, if you listen closely, some say you can hear something shift in the soil. Not like digging, like breathing. As if something beneath the surface is exiling slowly, waiting. Not dead. Not alive. Just listening. In 2018, a freelance geographer named Thomas Varelli conducted an unauthorized LIDAR survey of the Ashbridge site using a modified drone rig. He was a skeptic, one of those who believed local myths were just artifacts of trauma, born from years of poverty, isolation, and unspoken sins. What he was hoping to prove was geological sinkholes, mineral seams, perhaps even forgotten Civil War encampments misremembered as hauntings. What he found changed him. The LiDAR returned elevations, uneven, shallow depressions no more than 4 feet deep, arranged in a shape the software couldn't interpret. Varelli thought it was a rendering error until he ran the scan through a pattern recognition program used for analyzing Roman fort ruins. The result was horrifying in its simplicity. Not graves, not structures, a face, mile wide, broad forehead, sunken cheeks, 2 eye sockets pressed so shallow into the terrain they barely registered. And beneath them, the faint impression of a long, open mouth, too wide, too still. The contours of the land suggested something had once been beneath it, pushing up, or perhaps something had pressed down from above and left the shape behind. The program flagged one last feature, a central point, right where the nose would be, a vertical shaft of disturbed earth, straight down through centuries of soil, and around it coiled faint impressions in the sediment, like folds of cloth. Varelli shut off the program. He deleted the data, but the images had already uploaded to a decentralized cloud server he used for backups. 2 days later, his account was locked. The hosting company said the files had triggered a rare anomaly. The server crashed permanently. The only thing recovered was a screenshot he'd sent to a colleague in a moment of unease. The colleague posted it on an anonymous forum. It showed the central shaft, surrounded by soft rings of sediment. But the shaft wasn't empty. In the middle of it, standing perfectly upright, was something faintly vertical and narrow, pale, just visible against the darker soil. It resembled a spine, 10 vertebrae, maybe 11, perfectly intact, no ribs, no skull, just the spine, floating like a tether pulled tight and frozen in place. After that, the account disappeared. The forum was taken offline. Varelli vanished 3 months later during a trip to Wilcox County. He checked into a roadside motel, left the lights on, bed untouched, door locked from the inside. His belongings were found strewn around the bed, as if unpacked hastily and then reconsidered. But one thing wasn't found: his fingernails. Every single one had been removed. Not torn, removed surgically. No blood. The motel reported no strange sounds, no signs of entry. But the clerk on duty swore he saw something in the parking lot that night. A figure, too tall, he said, covered in something white like canvas or old linen, standing completely still, and next to it a wooden box. When he blinked, they were gone. A year later, in 2019, a cryptographer named Rowan Bell published a paper about non-linear narrative structures in folklore. She'd been studying religious ghost stories, how symbols drifted across time, mutating but never disappearing. In her appendix, she included a brief reference to the Ashbridge configuration, a term she said she borrowed from an old man at a roadside church who claimed to be a keeper of the silent ones. She never named the man, but she included a photograph. An altar carved from old wood, candles long burned down. Behind it, faintly visible under layers of soot, 41 black crosses, each one inverted. Beneath them, an empty circle. The caption reads simply, "The one they couldn't bury." Bell's paper was retracted. Not for any ethical reason. The journal issued a public notice, source contamination. Whatever that meant, no one explained. But Bell left her post shortly afterward. In her final blog post, she wrote only one sentence. It wasn't the parish that was buried. It was the memory of what it saw. Since then, the land has remained untouched. Federal maps list it as a protected wetland, though no water moves through it. The topsoil stays dry year-round. The birds do not pass overhead. Trail cameras placed by amateur explorers return blank footage, hours of static or washed-out light. But every so often, a single frame will contain something out of place, a shadow with no body, a tall silhouette half blocked by foliage, a shape that doesn't belong in the sequence of the world. And sometimes, more unsettling still, the same frame will appear twice, identical, as if time stuttered, as if something beneath that hollow is trying slowly to remember how to move. In 2021, a missionary organization attempted to erect a new cross near the Ashbridge site. They didn't last a day. The team, 7 members, reported the same sensation upon arrival, pressure in the head, like being underwater. Equipment failed. One man claimed to see a funeral taking place underground. They packed up and left. They never spoke of it again. But one photograph made its way online, shared anonymously by a family member of the group. It showed the team standing near the tree line at dusk. Behind them, the underbrush is thick, except for a white shape between the trees. Barely perceptible, but unmistakable. A long vertical figure standing motionless, and where the face should be, nothing. Just smooth white cloth, no eyes, no mouth, just a blank surface facing the camera. There is a silence that does not comfort, a quiet that does not soothe. It stretches not only through space, but through time, bending itself around the living and the dead alike. That's the silence people speak of, quietly, and only when drunk, when they refer to Ashbridge. And in the winter of 2022, that silence broke again. The Southern utility company Transline began clearing a corridor near the Wilcox County border, surveying soil, removing tree cover, and preparing for fiber optic expansion. A temporary crew was dispatched ahead of schedule, just to measure. They weren't supposed to dig, only to mark posts and grade the incline. The records say 4 men arrived on January 18th, only 3 left. Their report claimed the 4th man, Marvin Wells, wandered off, looking for a latrine spot. They waited, they called out, but no one answered. No broken branches, no trail, just a sudden stillness that settled in the woods like an old blanket. They eventually found his jacket, folded neatly beside a dead oak tree. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, but pinned inside the jacket pocket, secured by a tiny brass clasp, was something no one could explain. A sprig of sage, bone dry, wrapped in what appeared to be old sermon parchment, so brittle it flaked on contact, and scrawled on the back of the paper in delicate ink, "She has no shadow because she is the shadow." The men refused to return to the site. A formal investigation was launched, but found no evidence of wrongdoing. Wells was listed as presumed deceased due to exposure, but no body was recovered. No dogs would track past the tree line. The forest rejected the search. It always had. Later that year, a historian named Esther Clark unearthed a diary in an estate auction north of Selma. The handwriting was elegant, the paper thick and watermarked, the name inscribed inside the cover Lydia Albright, the final caretaker listed in the records of Ashbridge Parish. Her journal begins in 1909, 3 years before the official abandonment. The first entries are mundane, accounts of scripture, parish repairs, names of the sick. But as the pages continue, the tone begins to shift, slowly at first. The trees are listening again, she writes in April, and the graveyard breathes at night. By June, she stops referring to her congregation by name. They become the obedient, and then, later simply, the folding ones. But the most disturbing entries come that September, after a torrential storm swept through Wilcox County and unearthed several of the shallow burial mounds. Clark notes something chilling. Not one of the coffins was filled, not one body remained. Only the linens, wrapped in the shape of the bones, but hollow. She believed they'd been emptied, not by theft or decay, but by something she only called the presence that waits beneath. In her final entry, dated October 12, 1912, she wrote only this: "The witness has no mouth, but it is remembering how to speak." There is no further record of Lydia Albright. No census entries, no death certificate, only the diary, which was quietly removed from public record and sold into private hands. But before it vanished, a scanned copy was leaked onto a server that now no longer exists. Only fragments survive. In one of them, someone, presumably Clark, circled a phrase in red: "The 41st were buried to stop her, the 42nd to feed her," and then, written in the margin, almost too faint to see, "Who was the 42nd?" Some say it was Lydia. Others say it was never a person. It was the act. The moment the parish crossed a line they could never uncross. An unspoken liturgy. A covenant not with God, but with something that dwells outside language, outside chronology, a shape that does not move forward, but in circles, coiling through bloodlines and dirt and silence. Every generation forgets. Every so often something remembers. In 2023, a group of amateur urban explorers uploaded drone footage to a horror YouTube channel. They believed they'd found the Ashbridge site by triangulating obscure Baptist land transfer records. The footage is grainy. Most of it is uneventful. Trees, mud, the remains of an old foundation. But then the camera dips, almost by accident, into a clearing shaped like an open eye. No grass grows there. Just bare earth and cracked white clay. And for a brief moment, just a single frame, the drone captures something impossible. A woman standing alone, head tilted to one side, her face turned away, her arms outstretched, as if to receive something. But the most disturbing part isn't her appearance. It's her shadow. There isn't one. The sun is high. The angle should be sharp, but the ground beneath her is flat. Still unbroken. A glitch, perhaps. A lens issue. That's what commenters claimed. But the channel deleted the video within hours. Claimed they'd received a copyright strike, though no copyright was listed. And the team who shot the footage. They've never uploaded again. Their channel remains open, but silent. Just one new banner appears on the page, uploaded the same night as the video vanished. A line of text in white on a black background. She stands where the graves end. There's an unease that lingers not just in history, but in the soil itself. Certain places do not rot because of time. They rot because something in them remembers. Not with consciousness, but with instinct. The way a wound remembers pain when it's touched, even after it's healed. The land around Ashbridge has that memory, and in late 2023, something began moving through it again. A pair of cartographers from a small historical preservation firm were conducting a topographical survey of southern Alabama's forgotten religious sites, mapping overgrown cemeteries, long-lost mission churches, and indentured labor camps disguised as charity compounds. They were thorough, rational, men of maps, of ink and scale and archived deeds. They never meant to find Ashbridge. But while cross-referencing an 1857 Methodist expansion charter with a Confederate military burial tract, they discovered a 5-acre plot with no serial boundary, no grantee, and no tax ledger. A parcel not sold, but erased. When they arrived, they didn't recognize it at first. There was no signage, no marker. Only a stretch of tree, flattened hollow with unnaturally compacted soil. But one of them, a junior technician named Leo Morin, noticed something strange. The air was still, not silent but still, no movement, no insects, not even the brush of wind in the trees. Morin knelt to collect a sample and found the soil unusually warm, as if something beneath the surface radiated a slow, dull heat. He noted this in his field log. But then, without explanation, he added another sentence. There's a hush in the roots, like a choir beneath the floorboards. That night, their trail camera malfunctioned. Not just interference, complete memory wipe. 8 hours of missing footage. The only still image remaining on the SD card was from just after sunset. It shows a row of trees, shadows cast long across the ground. But one shadow is misaligned, longer than the others, narrow, human shape. But it doesn't correspond to anything standing in front of it. The space where a figure should be is empty. And yet the shadow falls. Sharp, clean, unmistakable. As if cast by something with no body. They left the site in silence. They did not publish. But a year later, in an unrelated academic journal, Morin submitted a short essay titled, Silent Architecture, The Unconscious Geometry of the Southern Dead. In it, he references a concept he calls the fourth-second shape, a theoretical arrangement of burial trauma and silence that mimics spiritual containment, a human-shaped negative space made not to enter but to bind, not a coffin, not a tomb, a seal. And once broken, he writes, that which was held inside does not escape, it reconfigures. Across the southeast, unrelated stories began surfacing in parallel. A church in rural Mississippi reported all 41 of its pews had been overturned during the night. No signs of entry, no alarms triggered. The pulpit, a simple pine construct over 100 years old, had been split exactly down the center, without splinters, like it had peeled open. Witnesses claimed they found a piece of cloth draped across the altar, a white linen, wrapped into a rough spiral. Another parish in Georgia reported a woman seen walking barefoot through their graveyard, silent, unmoving. When parishioners approached, she was gone. No footprints, but every headstone had been marked with chalk, just one word written again and again, witness. And then, on January 1st, 2024, a group of independent Baptist ministers met near Mobile to discuss what they were calling the returning. They never published minutes. No recordings were made. But the next day, one of them, Pastor Albert Greeley, emailed a colleague a scanned image from an old Ashbridge hymnal, mailed anonymously to his home. The final page was unnumbered, the melody lines scribbled in ink, but beneath it, written in a different hand, "When she comes in white, let the children lie still." He died by apparent heart failure 3 days later, but not before confiding something else to his daughter. A vision, he said. A dream, maybe, or a memory. He was back at Ashbridge, but this time, the coffins were not buried. They stood upright, half-rotted, their lids cracked open like mouths in mid-prayer, and inside each one was not a body, but fabric, cloth shaped like limbs, like torsos, like heads, hollow, and in the center of the graveyard, rising from a circle of broken stones, was a spire made of bones. But not human bones, too long, too narrow, too many joints. The daughter dismissed it as fevered imagination, grief, nothing more, until the day she went to clean out his study. In the center of the desk was a single item, a linen strip, yellowed with age, tied into a perfect spiral, wrapped around a brass clasp, shaped like a human tongue. One shadow wasn't following properly. It moved too slowly. It lagged behind by a beat, especially when she turned toward the altar. She quit the next day and moved to Florida. Her resignation letter was short. I kept praying, but I never felt watched. Then, in early 2025, a local genealogist from Selma compiled a list of confirmed deaths in and around Ashbridge Parish from 1890 to 1912. The final count, exactly 41 recorded burials, but in one photograph, an early sepia daguerreotype from 1908, the cemetery is shown in full, before overgrowth, and clearly visible in the clearing are 42 rectangular depressions in the soil. Not 41. 42. No marker for the last one, no stone, no cross. Only a circle of smooth river rocks around the edge, and at the center nothing. Not even grass, just bare earth. As if something was never buried. As if something was waiting to come out. The 40-second space is never named. It's never acknowledged in church records, never marked on a surveyor's map, never referenced in the oral accounts of the final congregation. But its presence is constant, a gap carefully maintained, not by accident, but by design, a scar left open, so the wound beneath could breathe. In the months following the genealogist's discovery, private researchers, historians, even amateur paranormal investigators began circling the Ashbridge plot with growing interest. They came with cameras, drones, EMF detectors, microphones tuned to subsonic resonance. Most found nothing, but some heard the humming. Low, wide frequency, not music exactly, closer to breath, looped through a choir of lungs that no longer remembered how to exhale. One man, a folklorist from Georgia, claimed that when he knelt beside the 42nd depression, the soil felt like skin, warm, faintly damp, and gently pulsing under his fingertips. He described it in his private journal. The earth beneath the 42nd is not dead. It is not even soil. It is something covered, something enduring. It knows its name is missing. He stopped writing entries after that day. His last post online was a photograph of his own bare feet, standing in a spiral of linen strips, captioned only, "She waits with her arms folded." He has not been seen since. No trace of him was found, except for a fragment of fabric discovered in the woods behind the Ashbridge tract, nailed into the bark of a dogwood tree. It was shaped like a collar, a linen collar, but when forensics attempted to remove it, the fibers crumbled instantly, decomposing into a fine, dark powder that left a faint spiral burn in the tree's bark. Meanwhile, church archivists in Montgomery began combing through the 1893 Ashbridge sermons in hopes of finding clues. Most were lost, water-damaged, handwritten in ink so faint it blurred under light. But one transcript survived, a sermon delivered by Reverend Eustace Glenholm just 4 months before the parish was shut down. It is titled, "On Folding," and it is unlike any sermon preserved in that era. In it, Glenholm does not speak of salvation of Christ or of sin. He speaks of alignment. To fold a thing is to teach it silence. He writes, to close a mouth without breaking the jaw, to bow a head without obedience. We folded her not in cruelty, but in kindness. Because she was not born, she was shaped. The next paragraph is illegible, but the final line is clear. May the 42nd remain unwitnessed. For it is not a body, it is a reply. A reply, not a person, not even a presence, a message, and for over a century, something has been waiting for the rest of the sentence. In the weeks that followed the sermon's rediscovery, strange entries began appearing in the visitor logs of nearby churches. Most weren't signed, but several were marked only with the number 42, drawn in soft looping script at the edge of the page. In one case, the entry was written upside down. In another, it appeared in 3 different handwritings on the same line. The names were all fictitious, scrambled rearrangements of the same 11 letters, used again and again. And in every case, the penmanship curved at the corners, spiral-shaped. Somewhere deep in the archives of the Alabama Historical Society, an intern scanning old Ashbridge pamphlets made a quiet observation. In a copy of the 1902 Easter program, every O in the body text, every single one, was slightly off-center, not oval, not circular, but coiled, as if each O was a tiny spiral bent inwards, as if even their language was folding itself closed. She reported it to her supervisor, but by the time they examined the document again, the effect had vanished. The letters were normal. Only the intern's marked-up photocopy still showed the anomaly. And at the bottom, in the corner, someone had scrawled in red ink, "You are not supposed to look." By mid-year, a new theory began to circulate, not among ghost hunters or historians, but among a small, paranoid faction of church reformers. They claimed that Ashbridge Parish had never been a parish at all, that it had been founded not for salvation, but for containment, that the 41 children were never orphans, they were wards, brought not to be adopted or educated, but to act as seals, human weights, living witnesses, to sit quietly on the lid of something that should never have been given form. And when the last child died in 1912, the seal lifted, not all at once, but gradually, incrementally, until now, over 100 years later, the 42nd shape, whatever it is, has begun to unfold, not loudly, not violently, but patiently, a presence with no name, a burial with no body, a question posed so long ago it has begun answering itself, one piece at a time. In 1948, a soil engineer named Luther Kaminsky was contracted by the state to survey abandoned parish lands in Sumter County. He took meticulous notes, pencil-etched sketches and topographical readings, and shorthand observations scribbled in the margins of his notebook. He died 2 weeks after returning from Ashbridge. His final entry, dated June 3rd, reads only, "The 42nd is not a plot. It's a mouth." And it never closed. His death was ruled natural causes, heart failure. But his assistant, who helped carry the notebooks to the survey office, later claimed that the pages of Kaminsky's final log were damp to the touch. Not with rain or sweat, but with something faintly viscous. Something that smelled of rotting cotton. She said her fingers stung afterward. And that night, she had a dream she couldn't forget. In it, she stood on the porch of a building she didn't recognize. Wooden steps, half buried in vines. A place with too many windows and not enough glass. She said the wind was strong, but the trees didn't move. And something beneath the floorboards was breathing, not deeply, but rhythmically, as if it had never stopped. In the center of the porch, folded carefully on the planks, was a linen dress. It had no sleeves, no seams, and it was exactly her size. She quit her position the next morning and never returned to archival work. But before leaving, she mailed one envelope to the State Archives. Inside was a photocopy of Kaminsky's final site sketch, hand-drawn, annotated with measurements in imperial units. There, plainly marked on the map, was the cemetery's full outline, 41 numbered plots, labeled with names and dates, and a 42nd, drawn not as a square, but as a spiral. No name, no date, only a note scrawled beside it in Kaminsky's handwriting. "Don't step here." The map was never added to the official file. Archivists marked it as inconclusive. But in the years that followed, more sightings began to emerge, not just from researchers, but from locals. People walking their dogs past the Ashbridge ruins. Families visiting distant relatives buried nearby. A photographer trying to capture the old church at dusk. They all reported the same thing: a girl, no taller than 9, standing at the edge of the woodline. She doesn't move, doesn't speak, but always faces away. Her arms hang strangely low. Her dress, if it can be called that, appears too smooth. No wrinkles, no fastenings, as if folded around her rather than worn. And her hair is wrong, not matted, not tangled, but patterned, curled into a spiral so precise it seems sculpted, each coil drawn tightly against the back of her scalp. One witness tried to photograph her. The image came out blank. But in the background, the cemetery fence can be seen bending slightly, as if drawn toward something heavy, as if the center of the frame held a gravity not visible, but deeply felt. No one has successfully approached her. Those who try report a sudden nausea, a low, humming pressure in their ears, as if submerged underwater. Others say their legs begin to tingle, then fail to move. Not paralysis exactly, more like resistance, as if the ground itself is reluctant to let them pass. And in every case, when they blink, she's gone. But the air where she stood remains warmer, as if something had just unfolded there. By 1950, the Baptist Historical Commission officially condemned any further excavation of the Ashbridge site. Their final memo reads, "The matter is closed. Any further study of the 42nd plot risks disturbing more than memory. Let what was folded remain folded." But it hasn't. Across the southern counties of Alabama, quiet phenomena persist. Choirs of children forgetting lyrics halfway through familiar hymns. Fresh graves dug only to reveal shallow coils of linen beneath the soil. Whispers in Sunday schools, never heard aloud, but remembered in perfect spiral patterns by children too young to understand handwriting. And in one case, a church bell that rang 42 times at dawn. Though no one pulled the rope, the bell was later removed. But the tower still groans at 5:03 a.m. every third Sunday, 42 seconds long, exactly, as if the reply is still being spoken, just very slowly. And somewhere, beneath the layered dust of 2 dead centuries, a mouth remains half open, waiting for someone to finish the sentence. The church records were boxed up and sent to Montgomery in 1952. 2 crates of ledgers, birth certificates, confirmation rosters, and handwritten sermons, sealed with wax and labeled H. Pierre Normand, ECTL. They sat unopened for 39 years in the basement of the State Archives. In 1991, during a flood restoration project, a junior historian named Daniel Lurie cataloged the contents for digital indexing. Most of the documents were brittle but intact. The ink had faded in places, but the names remained. 41 children accounted for, 41 baptisms, 41 confirmations. Except one ledger didn't match. It bore no date, no family name. The ink was a chalky reddish-brown, darker than the others, almost clotted on the page. Its pages had no columns, no dates, no structure, just a list, not of names, but of sounds, repeated syllables, some written phonetically, others with uncertain letters, as if the author had not understood the language, or perhaps had never heard it spoken, only felt it under the skin. At the bottom of the page was a single line, written with fierce pressure, the nib carving through the parchment. She hums to remember. But if you answer, she learns your name. Lurie quit the project 2 days later and moved to Arizona, where he refused to speak of his work in Alabama. He told his wife that certain stories weren't passed down. They were buried, and not by accident. The ledger disappeared. But several scans survived on a backup reel, filed under miscellaneous parish artifacts. For decades they went unnoticed, stored under mismatched metadata, until 2003, when a graduate student named Elise Romer accessed the file for her dissertation on rural orphanage liturgy. She didn't finish her paper, but her advisor preserved the last message she left, emailed at 3:11 a.m. It said only, "There's a pattern in the vowels. It isn't a song. It's a structure." When the advisor tried to follow up, Elise's university email account was gone. She never defended her thesis. No one knows where she went. But 4 months later, a linen dress was found nailed to the inside wall of a chapel broom closet in Perry County, perfectly folded, despite the rusted nails. Its fabric was nearly translucent, woven so tightly the threads shimmered like skin. There were no tags, no seams, no blood. But in the folded center of the dress, nestled like a locket, was a spiral of blonde hair, twisted into a perfect circle, bound with a single length of black twine. A state forensic team collected the object for cataloging. 3 weeks later, their storage facility experienced a structural failure. Floor collapse due to deep soil shift. Nothing was recovered from the impacted vault. The hole remained open for 6 months. No vegetation grew inside it. One field technician, returning to the site to finalize the damage report, claimed he saw something at the bottom, a shape, faint and shifting, just beneath the clay. He said it looked like a small figure, seated cross-legged, humming softly. He never returned to the site. But he left behind a final note, scribbled in the margin of a soil density report. Folded doesn't mean hidden. Folded means part of the page. The spiral has appeared elsewhere. In children's drawings, in prayer book margins, in the seating charts of chapels that no longer exist, always incomplete, always missing the final loop. It said that if you try to draw the spiral fully, without lifting your pen, your hand will begin to cramp, your knuckles will stiffen, and when you try to stop, your wrist will continue the motion on its own, drawing inward, again and again, until the paper tears, or until you forget what you were trying to finish, and only the shape remains. Those who study this pattern call it the parish coil. They say it's not a symbol. It's a behavior, a rhythm passed down not through words, but through silence, like a girl who stands at the edge of the woods and never turns around, who wears a dress without seams and hums a lullaby with no melody, waiting not to be seen, but to be completed. There is one last piece of film, shot in 1957 by a traveling ethnographer named Miriam Goss, who'd been tasked with recording regional hymns and oral traditions in Alabama's rural counties. Her notes are fastidious, precise, almost obsessive. She names every town, every church, every voice she records, except one. At the bottom of her final reel log, a line appears beneath the last entry. Unmarked site, near Ashbridge, children's chorus, partial recording. 2 min 17 sec. Interrupted. The tape itself is damaged. The first 30 seconds are clear 6 young voices, girls by the sound of them, singing a hymn in fractured harmony. The lyrics are standard. Jesus, keep me near the cross. But the tempo is strange, lagging then rushing, as if being led by someone not on mic. At second 31, the voices drop out. There's silence. Then, at 38 seconds, a low hum begins. It's not musical, not quite. It vibrates, not in the air, but somewhere in the lower register of the listener's own breath, as if the sound is coming from behind the ears or from inside the chest cavity. The hum continues, and then, barely audible, the static shifts. A new voice enters, not young, not old, not even clearly human, but it speaks a series of syllables, round, looping sounds, each one drawn out and closed gently, like the sound of a string being pulled tight and then let go. The archivist who digitized the tape in 2006 muted the final minute. He wrote in the record, "Playback induced physiological distress in 2 staff members. Nausea. Crying without stimulus. One technician reported intense urge to bury the recorder in the floor. Recovered after 2 hours." The muted section is labeled, "Undisclosed. See Goss file." But Goss's file is missing. Her field journals were never recovered. Her return train ticket was unused. She was last seen boarding a county bus heading west, toward the ruins of Ashbridge Parish. Witnesses remember her clearly. She was carrying a single item, a coiled bundle wrapped in muslin, held to her chest like an infant. The bus never reached its destination. No passengers were recovered. But in 1974, during pipeline excavation near the edge of Sumter County, workers uncovered an object 6 feet beneath the pine roots. It was a wooden hymnal box, empty, except for a single length of twine, and a name, carved carefully on the inner lid, in a child's hand. You heard her. They resealed the hole. No further digging was authorized. But if you go there, if you walk the edge of the old parish line, where the trees grow too close together and the air smells faintly of wet linen, you might hear it. Not words, not a song, just a low, curling hum. You won't remember when it starts, only that you've been listening for a while, and that somewhere beneath the soil, in a place no coffin was ever lowered, a breath is still being drawn in, waiting for the note that never ends. The girl who was never born, the mouth that was never closed, the story that was never written, only folded and folded again, until the page could hold no more. And even now, long after the parish fell silent, the spiral still draws you in, forever unfinished, forever humming, forever waiting to remember your name.